Hi again then guys, and welcome to, of course, the first review from the batch of 9 cars from the 1.29 update, and just like the tune earlier on today, we are first considering the Pagani Zonda R. The car which, so far, definitely for me, I know for many of you guys as well, has been the most controversial, you could say, vehicle in the pack, because of its placement, more than anything else. But for those who haven't driven it yet, maybe you haven't bought it yet, it's not just the placement that might surprise you and sometimes disappoint you, because the handling on the Zonda R in GT Sport is very different to what it was in GT6, and doubtless if they added something like a Furai or an FXX, which are of course great rivals to it, they would probably feel similar to this as well, especially given how the LaFerrari feels, how the Vulcan feels. They are much twitchier than in the past of the franchise, much more slippery. They are professional level machines. They do not nanny you. They are completely unforgiving for the most part, and you really have to use them properly. Now, in the case of the Zonda R, I will say that compared to those other two, it doesn't feel quite as worthwhile to actually put the effort into learning how to use it because of the Group X category. Now, we need to get that out of the way first, because of course that was not an issue at all in GT6, which is when we last reviewed this car, because we had the PP point system, so it wasn't an issue at all. It was up around 683 performance points, I think, fully tuned, well over 1100 horsepower, I think it was, extremely quick, one of the best track day kind of cars in the game, great handling too, and it was always a great rivalry between that and the FXX. Now personally, I'd really love them to bring back the FXX, and perhaps surprisingly again, I would actually prefer an FXX to an FXXK, the LaFerrari base model. I know that's kind of strange, but I just prefer that one. Overall though, the fact that this is in Group X it's going to continue to be a debated thing. Some people think it's a bad thing, some people think it should be there, some people are kind of on the fence, some people just don't care. All of those are valid points from certain points of view, but for me, where I fall on that is fairly obvious. I've talked at length about my disdain for Group X, not as a concept, but in its use. It's a great idea. It's where the cars that are too good for racing should be. The Tomahawks, the Red Bulls. But it is a dumping ground. We've established that. You've got stuff like drift cars in there, you've got classic race cars, you've got a BMW hybrid. That should not happen. So with all of that being said, the Zonda R being in there, to me, it's more about the inconsistency in the game, more so than it being in Group X. Fundamentally, I understand why it is, but the reason why that annoys me is not because the Zonda R is in Group X. That may be the weird thing. The reason why it annoys me is because the Vulcan isn't. Now, the Vulcan, of course, has a road-going version, which is what many people bring up to try and justify the difference, but that's rubbish, because initially it was not a street-legal car, and there have also been street-legal variations of stuff like the MC12 Corsa and the FXX, modified by companies like EDO Competition, where they've extensively altered road cars or detuned, in effect, racing versions to allow them to be street legal. Even certain race cars have been made street legal. There's a road legal Porsche 962 with the Rothmans livery in Japan, just driving on the street. So it can be done. But the point is, the Vulcan was not originally a street car, and the version that's in the game is not the street car, it's the track-only version, and it's that inconsistency that I do not like. Now with that to one side, because we can't change that now, and I doubt that Polyphony will either, what's the car itself like? Well, as I alluded to, many people are not going to like the handling because it's a lot more slippery. It feels like it has significantly less downforce, it feels much more challenging, and it's no way near as dominant as it used to be. There were very few cars that were not race cars that could keep up with the Zonda R in GT6. In fact, the only things that could were pretty much stuff like the Viper ACR, maybe a GTR Black Edition, perhaps a couple of others like the Tommy Kyra, but generally speaking, not many cars could. Now, well, as I said in my tune earlier on today, I took it around the Nordschleifer, stock power, stock weight, but tuned the settings, and it was quicker than the real world record, but it was still slower than my Porsche 911 RSR, which is a less powerful car. So an interesting comparison, a heavier vehicle with less power but still quicker. So a very interesting comparison, and probably not one that you'd expect. Now, that's not to say that this Zonda R is slow. It's not, of course, it's incredibly quick, but I think that it's one of those cars that's unfortunately just going to fall the wrong side of the fence for many players. The handling is not what it used to be, the sound is nowhere near as loud and as screaming and as shrieking as the car should be. Of course, the performance is completely different, primarily due to the handling, and I would say that one of the only advantages of this one over the previous game is that you can actually drop the weight for the first time, because the car isn't exactly heavy anyway, it's 1,070 kilos, but you can drop it to about 945, which is very cool. That's almost prototype territory. Unfortunately though, it doesn't really make it any better. In fact, it actually makes it a worse handling car because you just don't really have the weight to ground the tyres, and it shreds up the tyres a lot, exiting corners in particular. So overall, my thoughts on this one are mixed. I love Pagani, of course. I believe that they are one of the greatest brands ever, and they've done an amazing job of bursting into the scene very late in the game as far as the automotive world goes, around the turn of the century, but they've done really well for themselves, making fantastic cars, some of my absolute favourites. But this interpretation, this representation of the Zonda R, is it more realistic than GT6? In many ways, yes. Definitely. The top speed is far more realistic. The handling is, I don't doubt, far more realistic. It probably should be this challenging, but that's not going to make people like it more. In fact, I think that overall less people are going to like it, and when it's 1.8 million, I think that less people are going to ultimately use it. In fact, a lot less people, I guarantee, are going to use it and race it compared to the kind of use that it had in GT6. You would see them all the time in GT6, whereas now I just don't think that's going to happen, partially because of Group X, partially because of the way it performs, and also because people tend to spend money in GT Sport only on the cars that they really want or need the most, because you know that you have a chance of winning everything else. So I think that sales for this car will be very low. Not that that particularly matters, but it's just an interesting way of thinking about a car's popularity compared to a previous game. But overall, my thoughts are definitely mixed. If you haven't already checked out my tune setup for it from earlier today, primarily focusing on the cornering ability, if you're having trouble, I would recommend trying that. To some degree though, just like the LaFerrari, just like the Vulcan, there's just that inherent character to its performance that you can't really change. It's not a bad car by any stretch. There are just a couple of things that make it unfortunately placed. It's a vehicle that falls into a category that so many others are already in, but it feels so much more limited in scope. At least, for instance, the classic race cars can race now, whereas with the Zonda and a couple of others like the Drift Subaru in particular, or the Time Attack Subaru, they just feel so limited in scope, they have so few actual rivals, and to deny the Zonda R the rivalry of a Vulcan really is a shame, because that would have been a perfect rivalry. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the Zonda R. Doubtless there will be mixed thoughts in the comments. And that's it for this pick, so of course stick around tomorrow, where we're going to be covering the Maserati Gran Turismo in both tune and review videos. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.